They told her the house had been sold to a stranger, and she let them believe she was that stranger's servant rather than its rightful heir. Rosalind Thorne had practiced the lie until it sat easy in her mouth. She had practiced the slope of her shoulders, the way a lady's maid kept her eyes a fraction lowered, the flat country vowels that did not belong to a woman, raised in the very room she was now applying to clean. When the carriage let her off at the bottom of the drive at Wexford Hall, 3 miles outside Charlottesville in the autumn of 1816, she carried one trunk and a forged letter of character signed by a Mrs. Ainsley who did not exist. The gravel under her boots was the same gravel she had run across barefoot as a girl, chasing her father's hounds. She did not let her face change. She had learned, over the 11 months since her father's death, that a face that changed was a face that gave things away. The man who had taken Wexford Hall from her was named Theodore Crane, and he had done it the way clever men did such things, with paper rather than violence. Her father, Augustus Thorne, had died with debts no one had known about and a will that turned out to be 2 wills, the second one witnessed by men who could no longer be found. By the time Rosalind understood what was happening, the estate, the lands, the name on the deed, all of it had passed to Crane, who held a mortgage her father had apparently signed in the last fevered month of his life. The courts in Richmond had been polite. They had also been useless. A young woman of 26 with no husband, no brother, and no money cannot fight a man who holds the paper. And Rosalind had walked out of that courtroom understanding that the law was a door that only opened from one side. So she had decided to come in through the servants' entrance instead. The housekeeper who received her was a broad, tired woman named Mrs. Dunmore, who read the forged letter without much interest and asked whether she could mend lace. Rosalind said she could. She could, in fact, do a great many things a maid had no business knowing, but she had spent the carriage ride deciding which of her accomplishments to bury. She would not let on that she read Latin. She would not let on that she knew the house held a priest hole behind the library paneling, or that the 3rd stair from the top of the east staircase had creaked since before she was born, or that her mother was buried under the willow at the bottom of the south lawn beneath a stone that simply said beloved, because her father had been too undone to manage more. "You'll share with Annie," Mrs. Dunmore said. "Mr. Crane keeps a quiet house. He don't like to be looked at direct, and he don't like questions. You do your work, and you'll have no trouble from him." "Yes, ma'am," said Rosalind, who intended to do nothing but ask questions very quietly for as long as it took. She had not seen Theodore Crane in person until her 4th day. She was carrying a coal scuttle up the east staircase, past the 3rd stair, which still creaked, when a door opened below and a voice she did not know said her name. Not her name, the name she had given. "You girl." She turned and looked down, and there he was in the hall, a man of perhaps 40, neither tall nor short, dressed with a care that struck her as anxious rather than vain. He had the kind of face that had decided long ago not to show anything, and she recognized the discipline of it because it was the same discipline she had spent the last year building, in herself. They were, she thought, 2 people who had each constructed a face. The difference was that she knew she was lying, and she was not yet certain he did. "Yes, sir," she said. "This staircase is not for general use." "The back stairs." "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry, sir." He looked at her a moment longer than the exchange required, but she kept her eyes down on the 3rd button of his waistcoat and waited, and after a moment he turned and went back into the room he had come from, which was her father's study, which was now his. The door closed. She climbed the rest of the stairs with the coal scuttle and her heart going hard and even, and she thought, he doesn't know. He looked at the woman whose house this is, and he saw a girl who took the wrong stairs. That was the first thing she learned about Theodore Crane. He did not see what he was not looking for. The second thing took longer. She had come to Wexford to find the second will, the real one, the one she was certain existed, because her father, whatever his faults, and they had been many and expensive, had loved her, and a man who loved his daughter did not leave her to a stranger on purpose. Somewhere in that house was paper that told the truth, and she meant to find it, and once she had it, she would carry it to a different court in a different city, and she would take her name back. That was the whole of the plan. It was not a good plan. She knew it was not a good plan, but grief is a poor architect, and it was the plan she had, and she had given up everything she had left to come and live inside it. The trouble was that she had not accounted for the house itself. She had expected Wexford to feel like a wound. Instead, it felt like a question. The rooms had been rearranged, the curtains changed, the portraits of her family taken down and stacked. She eventually discovered, in a locked storeroom off the gallery, faces to the wall. Her mother's morning room had become a place where Crane did accounts, and yet the bones of the house were the same. And walking its corridors at night with a candle, in the hours when the other servants slept, she kept finding herself not in the present, but in some folded-over version of her childhood, turning a corner expecting her father's laugh and meeting only the dark. She had thought hatred would sustain her. She found instead that hatred was tiring, and that grief kept getting in underneath it, the way water gets in under a door. She learned the household. She learned that the cook, a sharp old woman named Mrs. Vane, had been kept on from the old days and remembered the Thorns, though she did not remember Rosalind, who had been a child the last time Mrs. Vane saw her, and was a grown woman now, thinner and harder, and wearing another woman's name. She learned that the solicitor who handled Crane's affairs, a soft-spoken man called Mr. Pelham, came every second Thursday and stayed for dinner, and was the only person Crane spoke to, as though speaking were a pleasure rather than a tax. She learned that Crane himself rose early, rode out, alone, ate little, and sat up late in the study with the lamp burning, and that more than once when she carried his cold tea away at midnight, she had found him not working, but simply sitting, looking at the fire, with the particular stillness of a man who did not like the company of his own thoughts, but told herself this meant nothing. She told herself this meant nothing. A guilty man might sit up late. A guilty man might not eat. She catalogued his stillness as evidence and refused to let it become anything softer. The search went badly. The study was locked when he was out and occupied when he was in. She gave it 3 weeks before she understood she would need a key or an invitation, and that the only way to get either was to make herself useful enough to be trusted and invisible enough to be forgotten, which were, she discovered, almost the same project. She mended lace beautifully. She learned to bring his tea the way he liked it, very strong, no sugar, and to set it down without a word, and after a while he stopped saying anything at all when she came in, which she took as progress, because a man does not guard himself against the furniture. Then, in the 6th week, the dog changed everything. Crane had a dog, an aging pointer named, she gathered, after no one, who had belonged to the house before him and had simply stayed the way Mrs. Vane had stayed. The dog had loved her father. It did not love Crane exactly, but it tolerated him, and it had taken inconveniently to following Rosalind through the house, because some animal part of it had recognized something in her that the people had not. One evening it got into the locked storeroom when a footman left the door ajar, and Rosalind went in after it, and that was how she came to be alone with the stacked portraits of her own family, faces to the wall, in the half-dark when Theodore Crane came looking for his dog and found her instead. She had turned one of the portraits around. It was her mother, 18 years old in the painting, painted the year she married, in a blue dress Rosalind could still remember the feel of, because it had hung in a wardrobe all through her childhood, and she had pressed her face into it after the funeral to see if it still smelled of anything. It did not. And now here it was, the painted version, propped against the wall in the dark, and Rosalind was kneeling in front of it with the dog, leaning warm against her side, and her composure. That whole year of composure, simply gone, tears running down her face in the dark where she had been certain no one would ever see. "What are you doing in here?" She got to her feet fast, wiping her face, the dog scrambling up beside her. The dog, "Sir, he got in. I came after him. I'm sorry, sir." But Crane was not looking at her. He was looking at the portrait. He had gone very still in the doorway, lamp in hand, and his face, that constructed face, had come apart in a way she had never seen, and he said, not to her, almost to himself, "Put that back. Sir, put it back the way it was." His voice was not angry. That was the strange thing. It was something worse than angry. "I don't." He stopped. He started again. "Those are not to be disturbed." And Rosalind, who had spent 6 weeks being furniture, made the first true mistake of her campaign, because she was tired and undone and standing in front of her dead mother's face, and she said, before she could stop herself, in her own voice, the real one, the one with the city in it and not the country, "Why do you keep them at all, if you can't bear to look at them?" The silence afterward was very large. Crane looked at her then, really looked, the way he had not looked on the staircase. She watched him hear the voice she had let slip, watched him set it against the face he thought he knew, and she understood with a cold dropping feeling that she had just handed a clever man the one thread he needed. She lowered her eyes. Too late. He had heard it, but he did not say what she expected. He did not accuse her. He stood there with the lamp, throwing his shadow huge against the turned portraits, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone quiet and careful. And what he said was, "Because they were here when I came." And it seemed to me that a man who would throw a family's faces on the fire to feel easier in his own house would not be a man worth the house. He looked at the portrait of her mother. I did not know her. I did not know any of them. But I have read every letter in this study, trying to understand the man whose ruin let me become what I am, and I will tell you what I have come to think. Since you have asked me a question, no servant has any business asking. He set the lamp down on a crate. I think I am living in a house I had no right to take, and I have not yet decided what an honorable man does about that. 11 months too late. Rosalind stood absolutely still. She had built her whole year on the certainty that Theodore Crane was a thief. It was the certainty that had let her forge a letter and lie to a kind housekeeper and bury her own name. And here he was, standing in the dark in front of her mother's painted face, telling her he thought he was a thief too, and meaning it, and the floor of her plan tilted very slightly, the way a ship's deck tilts before you have understood that the sea has changed. "You're crying for them," he said. It was not quite a question. "They were a good family," she said, which was true, and was the closest she would come that night to the rest of it. "You knew them? My people served them." Another lie, balanced on a truth. "Before." He nodded slowly, as though that explained the voice, the grief, the question, and she let him believe it, and she hated that she was relieved. He told her to put the portrait back. She did. He picked up his lamp and his dog and left her there in the dark, and she stood among the turned faces of everyone she had lost, and understood that her enemy had just become a problem of an entirely different shape. After that he began to talk to her. Not much, not at first, but the wall of his silence had a door in it now, and he had shown her the door himself. And so when she brought his tea he would sometimes say a sentence, and then two, and she learned against every intention she had carried up that drive, that Theodore Crane had been a younger son of a merchant family in Baltimore, that he had made his money in shipping and lost most of it and made it again, that he had bought the mortgage on Wexford from a broker in Richmond as an investment, and had not understood until it foreclosed, that there was a daughter, that the daughter had no one, that the law that handed him a house had quietly destroyed a living person he had never met. He told her this in pieces, over weeks, in the way a man confesses to a furniture he has forgotten is a person, and Rosalind, who was that person, sat in the room where her father had died and listened to the man who had taken everything from her describe his guilt as though it were a stranger's, and said nothing, and brought the tea, and learned where he kept the study key. He kept it on a ribbon around his neck. She saw it the night he fell asleep at the desk, his head down on his folded arms, the lamp guttering, the ribbon slipped out from his collar, and the small brass key resting on the green leather of the blotter. She stood in the doorway with the cold tea in her hands and looked at the key and understood that she could have it. He slept badly and seldom. He had told her so himself, complaining of it the way the lonely complain of small things to be allowed to complain of anything. She could lift the ribbon over his bowed head. She could open every drawer in this room tonight and find, or fail to find, the thing she had come for, and either way be gone before he woke. It was the whole plan, delivered to her sleeping, asking only that she take it. She set the tea down. She reached for the ribbon, and the dog, lying by the cold hearth, lifted its head and thumped its tail once against the floor, and Crane stirred, and she stepped back, and the moment closed like water. She told herself it was the dog. She lay awake beside Annie in the narrow servants' room and told herself it was only the dog, and knew it was not only the dog, and did not let herself look at the other reason directly, the way you do not look at the sun. The truth came out, in the end, not because she found the will, but because the solicitor recognized her face. Mr. Pelham came on his second Thursday in December, and at dinner Rosalind was carrying in the soup when he looked up at her, and his spoon stopped halfway to his mouth, and she knew the way prey knows, an instant before the danger has a name. He was an old man. He had handled Thorne affairs once, long ago, before Crane, before any of it, in the years when her father still trusted lawyers. He had seen her at 14 across a drawing room, and something in the turn of her head over the soup tureen reached back across 12 years and found her, and his face did the arithmetic, and he set down his spoon and said into the quiet of the dining room, "Forgive me, but you are very like the late Mr. Thorne's daughter." The room went still. Mrs. Dunmore at the sideboard went still. Crane, at the head of the table, set down his glass and looked at her, and she stood there with the tureen growing heavy in her hands, and the whole architecture of the lie standing exposed in the candlelight. And she understood that there was no version of the next minute in which she remained a servant. So she put the tureen down on the sideboard, carefully, because her hands were shaking, and she did not want to drop her grandmother's china, and she straightened up to her full height, which was greater than a maid's, and she spoke in her own voice, the real one, for the second time in that house. "I am Rosalind Thorne," she said. "My father was Augustus Thorne, who built the wing you take your accounts in, and is buried in the churchyard at Wexford with the rest of them. I was born in the room you sleep in." She looked at Crane, and she let him see, all of it now, the whole year, the forged letter and the buried name and the coal scuttles and the tea, brought strong with no sugar by the woman whose house he had taken. "I came to find the will my father truly wrote. I came to take my name back from you. I have been 3 months under your roof learning your habits so that I could rob you of the proof that you robbed me. That is who has been bringing your tea." She had expected, when she imagined this moment, that she would feel triumph, or at least relief, the lanced wound of the secret finally open. She felt neither. She felt only very tired and very visible, and braced for the constable he would surely call. Theodore Crane sat for a long moment without speaking. Mr. Pelham looked between them, appalled and fascinated. The dog, under the table, sighed. And then Crane began slowly to laugh, not cruelly, not with any triumph of his own, but with a small thing that sounded almost like relief, like a man who has been waiting a long time in a dark room and has finally heard another person breathe. "You took the wrong stairs," he said. "On your 4th day. I remember. I told you to use the back ones." He shook his head. "I have been having dinner sent up to the study 3 nights a week for 2 months so that I would not have to face a household that I knew, somewhere in the part of me I do not consult, contained at least one person who hated me rightly. And it was you. Of course it was you. You brought the tea." He looked at Pelham. "Get the box." The lawyer did not understand, neither did Rosalind. "The deed box, Crane said. "From the study, the small one, under the floor of the cabinet. You'll need the key." He lifted the ribbon over his own head, the key she had nearly stolen, and held it out across the table, not to Pelham but to her. "I found it in September. The 2nd will. Your father's true one, witnessed properly, leaving the whole of Wexford to his daughter Rosalind, with a codicil discharging the debt I bought. The 1st will, the one the courts honored, was forged after his death by the broker who sold me the mortgage. I have known since September that this house is yours." The candle flame stood very straight. Somewhere far off in the house a clock was striking. "I did not know how to give it back," Theodore Crane said, and now the constructed face was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was only a tired and honest man who had been carrying a thing too heavy to set down alone. "I am not a brave man. I told myself I would find the daughter and make it right, and then I could not find the daughter, because the daughter had vanished, because the daughter," he almost smiled, "had taken a position in her own house under a false name to rob me, which is precisely the sort of thing I should have expected of Augustus Thorne's child. If I had known the first thing about her, which I now find I want very much to do. Here is what no one tells you about getting back the thing you have lost. You think the moment will undo the year. You think the house will become, the instant it is yours again, the house it was before. It does not." Rosalind Thorne stood in her own dining room, in another woman's borrowed name, holding a brass key still warm from a stranger's neck, and felt the whole shape of her grief turn over and show its other side, which was not triumph, and was not even quite forgiveness, but was something stranger and more durable. The recognition that the man she had come to ruin had spent 3 months ruining himself quietly for her sake before he ever knew her face. She did not take the key that night. She told him to keep it until the papers were properly drawn, by a different solicitor, in a different city, so that no one could ever say a word about how it was done. She was, even then, even with her name half returned to her father's daughter, and her father's daughter did things in order. Pelham wept, which surprised everyone. Mrs. Dunmore told the whole of it, said only that she had thought there was something about the new girl's lace, and went back to the sideboard. The will was filed in Richmond in February. The house came back to her in March, with the spring, the willow at the bottom of the south lawn putting out its first green over the stone that said beloved. Theodore Crane left Wexford the day the deed was signed, and Rosalind did not stop him, because some things have to be set down all the way before they can be picked up differently, and a man and a woman cannot begin honestly inside a house one of them stole from the other, however the stealing came about. But he wrote to her, that spring and into the summer, letters in a careful merchant's hand, about nothing, about everything, about a history of botanical illustration he had found in a Baltimore bookshop and thought she might want, about the dog which he had, to her quiet fury and private joy, taken with him and now reported on as though filing dispatches from a campaign. And in the autumn, a full year after a young woman in a borrowed name had walked up a gravel drive carrying one trunk and a lie, a carriage came up that same drive, and the man who got out of it did not go to the servants' entrance and was not asked to. She met him at the door of her own house, in a blue dress that had been her mother's, taken up and let out and made over until it fit no one but her. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her and did not for once construct anything with his face. "I have come to ask you something," he said, "and I would rather do it badly and honestly than well and false, so I will simply say it. I took your house by accident and gave it back on purpose, and the giving back is the only thing I have ever done that I am sure was right. I have no claim on you. I know that. I have come anyway." "I know you have," she said. "You always did the hard thing 11 months late. I've decided to find it one of your better qualities." The dog, ancient now and stiff in the hips, came down the steps past her skirts and went to him and leaned its whole weight against his legs, and he bent and put his hand on its gray head and looked up at her still, waiting, the way an honest man waits when he has said the true thing and given the other person all the room in the world to refuse it. She came down the steps. The gravel was the same gravel. She had run across it barefoot as a child and walked up it as a liar, and now she crossed it, in her mother's blue dress, in her own name, one toward a man who had handed her back her life and then stood out in the cold to ask if there might be room in it for him. "Come inside," Rosalind Thorne said. "It's your house, too, if you'll have it the honest way. We'll have tea. I'll even put sugar in yours for once, to show there's no hard feeling." He laughed, and she found she was laughing too, and the door of the house stood open behind her, and the light came out of it gold and ordinary onto the steps, and they went in together out of the autumn cold, and the dog went with them, and the house at last was simply a house where people lived, which is the only thing any house was ever for.